Hi, I'm Warrick from harderandsteenbeck, and today we're going to talk about a really important topic in the world of airbrushing, which is paint. Because if we can't make the paint work, then we're not going to be doing any airbrushing of any note whatsoever. There's a lot of discussion in the airbrush world. What is the optimal consistency for your paint? Now, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to be complicated or clever here, but of course it does to a certain degree depend on what you're trying to do with it. So what we're going to do for the purposes of this video is we're going to ignore all of the fringe requirements and we're just going to focus on the main requirement, which probably covers about 80 to 90% of what we're doing, which is when we're looking for coverage, we're looking for color fades, blends, using color as a kind of a glaze and a tint, and let's say detail highlights, but not extreme detail highlights, just like a reinforcing of a zenithal or something like that. So how do we prepare paint to do these tasks? Now, I'm going to use an example here of two different Vallejo colors to start out with. We're going to take a look at their Vallejo Game Color ink. Now, this stuff sprays really nice right out of the tin or out of the bottle. I'm going to put some directly in the airbrush and I'm going to use it to illustrate the method that I'm going to encourage you to use when you're testing a paint to see if it's of the right consistency. You'll notice that I clean the top of the paint bottle with water before I put the cap on. That's because I never want to have any paint drying on that nib, which might then get into the airbrush as a flake later on. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop a bit of Game Color ink into the bottom of this lid here and just see how it behaves when we dip something into it and see how the drip comes off. We want to load that up with paint. We want to look at how that's going to drip. Now, if I bring this vertical, you're going to see that the drip forms. And when it breaks, there's no elasticity on that drip. Now, that's the key. You don't want that drip to stretch and drop off. If it does that, the paint is going to be too thick to airbrush. I'm going to leave this in here. And we're going to do the same thing with a little bit of their brush paint. So a similar color. This is the Game Color Bloody Red. Give it a bit of a shake. And what you're going to notice right away is, of course, we know that this color is going to be thicker. But when we look to see how it's going to drip, it's going to be a massive difference. So we'll get the end of that paintbrush nicely covered in paint and lift it out. And you can see right away, this drip has got a huge amount of elasticity to it. Okay, it really pulls out long before it falls off and breaks. That elasticity in the drip is what you don't want in an airbrush preparation. Now, even with a brush paint, we can modify that and change it so it's going to work in the airbrush. So if we get some Vallejo airbrush thinner, with the regular paints, you're going to have to put in a little bit more than 1:1. So I'm going to say closer to 2:1 to get the property that we want. We give it a bit of a mix here. And now if we load that end of that paintbrush up now and pull it out, what we're going to see, I think, okay, there's still some elasticity on that drip. So we're going to need to put a little bit more thinner in to get this to be an optimal airbrush formulation. So let's give that a good mix again. Let's take another look at how that drip forms. So we'll load that end up really nicely with some paint. And let's take a look at that drip. Okay, so now we're looking at it from here, and that didn't really extend before it just broke off and fell. So I'm going to say that this is now an acceptable formulation for the airbrush. So let's test this. I'm going to show you the differences. We're going to spray this optimally thin formulation. We're going to spray the unthinned ink, and then we're going to throw in some unthinned Game Color just to see the different results that we're going to get with this way of checking the formulation. Okay, so the first color that we're going to drop into the airbrush is the thinned Game Color preparation. So this was a regular Game Color paint. It's a brush paint. We've thinned it with some thinner. It turned out to be around about 2 parts thinner to 1 part paint, somewhere around there. And we found that when we dip the back of the paintbrush into it now, it drips off without any elasticity. So what we're going to do for this test is we're going to drop some of these paint formulations into the airbrush and do some basic checks to see how well the airbrush is atomizing, how well it's flowing for detail work, and what it feels like at the front of the trigger, what sort of control we're getting. So I'm just going to put a few drops of that into the airbrush, just so that we've got enough to run this test, but not enough that it's going to be a drama to clean it all out. Okay, so let's see how it runs. So this is Game Color, a brush paint that's been thinned 2.5 to 1 with the Vallejo thinner. So the atomization looks beautiful. It's running down very nicely in detail work. We're still getting excellent opacity. The control on the front of the trigger, oh, it's got a great feel. Beautiful. Absolutely the same every time. Super reliable. A lot of subtlety. I can build exactly what I want there. Dagger strokes. Got great control. Actually, I love it. Works really good. So that is a great formulation that's working really well. Now we're going to come back to that and see how much of a difference that thinning made. Now, one thing I just want to draw your attention to. I'm going to paint my fingernail with this just to see how quickly this hyper-thinned formulation is still going to build up opacity. And I'm going to wager that it still builds opacity up really, really well. Now, bear in mind, that's actually covering a bit of black primer that I had on my nail beforehand, and that's built up opacity really quickly and really easily. If I want it to be a little bit more vibrant, it's still going to perform absolutely beautifully. So over-thinning your paint, as long as you then apply it in multiple strokes, works absolutely beautifully. There's no need to use it thick, and actually the surface finish that you're going to get is going to be compromised if it's too thick. Now what we're going to do is we're going to throw this brush Game Color straight into the airbrush and contrast how it performs against its thinned counterpart. I'm just going to put a couple of drops in there. Now one thing that you're going to notice here is the airbrush is going to sound very different. It's going to be a much rougher sound because this paint is going to be much harder to atomize. Can you hear the difference in that? So when we go then onto our page here, we've got to pull the trigger so much further back to get the same amount of flow. And we've got a pattern here that looks a little bit rough around the edges. In terms of what's capable for detail work, yes, we can still draw lines with this, but oh my goodness, it's nowhere near as pleasant as when it's thinned. When we go back to doing the dots, we can see it's just so much more difficult to get these similar dots down as it was there. That I did it in a fraction of the time than it's taken me to do this, and I don't feel anywhere near like the same level of control. Painting onto the fingernail. So what's interesting is yes, we can develop a bit of opacity. The reason why I'm using my fingernail, by the way, is because it's a non-porous surface that's similar to what you find on a model. I can develop the opacity very quickly, but the amount of control I've got over doing that is very, very limited. It's just going to be a full red, and I can't kind of pick what I do in between times. I can feel that the airbrush is already starting to get a bit of tip dry because, of course, the paint didn't have all that much fluid in it to start with. So we can see ease of use from this very thin version of the same paint. It's nothing like using it thicker. So if we've already got a paint in the airbrush that's too thick, and we know we've got to get it out of there and put in a formulation that's better for the airbrush, can we rectify it when it's in the airbrush? Well, the answer is yes, we can. It's always better to put the thinner in first if you're going to mix in the airbrush, but you can do it the other way around if you find yourself in this situation. So we're just going to drop some thinner in on top of that. And then we're going to use the bubble back technique where we pinch the front of the airbrush, press down on the trigger, and just pull the trigger back a little bit, to mix those two components together. Now, we're still going to have some of the thick paint sitting up here in the very front of the airbrush, so we want to get rid of that first. You'll know when it's gone because everything will start flowing much easier and the airbrush will sound much more fluid and smooth and just nice, actually. And now what we're going to find is we've got this beautiful responsive feel again. Exactly the same formulation, we've just built it in the airbrush. And now when we go back to our dots again, going to be super reliable. Every little movement I make on the trigger, I'm getting exactly what I expect every single time. detail. Wonderful. If I go then onto the fingernail again, so you can see one side by side, I can build up whatever hue I want to full vibrancy really easily. And you can see I've now got really full control over whatever hue I want to build up with this paint. So yes, you can fix it in the airbrush, absolutely not a problem. Of course, always better to get it right first time out by putting the thinner in first, dropping the paint down on top of it, and then mixing it in the airbrush. Now we're going to go back to that ink and just see how that formulation compares with what we've constructed from the standard paintbrush game color. So here we've got it here. It's been sitting in this cap for a little while. We're just going to use it anyway. So if anything, it's going to be a touch thicker than when it came out of the bottle. But this stuff works really rather marvelously through the airbrush. So here we go. We're going to do the atomization test. And as we can see, doesn't it spray beautifully cleanly? We're going to do some of these dots just to see how responsive it is to that. I feel like I've got total control over that. So the detail capability that we're going to get with the ink is actually really rather lovely as well. And the response from the trigger, very reliable. I would say, I think the ink, you can also use it for really strong coverage. So we can build that up nicely as well to get a very opaque finish. So all in all, I think it performs really, really well. I think if you want to have it perform optimally well, if you're going to use it as a glaze, you could even thin the ink even slightly more. So we're going to do that now just to see what kind of result we get. Just going to drop 2 drops of thinner in on top of that. And the point that I'm trying to make in doing this is really that I don't think you can over-thin a paint with the airbrush. The only instance where you're going to over-thin a paint is if you're looking to make one stroke, one detail, where you want maximum opacity, and the stroke is so small that you can't afford to hit that same point again because you might make it grow. If you're doing a stroke like that, the first question you're going to ask yourself is, would I be better off doing it with a brush? And if the answer is yes, then do it with a brush. But if you really feel you need to do it with the airbrush, then yes, you might use a thicker paint there. But for really everything else, when you're color controlling, when you're fading, when you're highlighting, when you're doing glazes, when you're trying to build up hues, when you're doing highlights, to go across the subject more than one time and have more decision points about when it is enough, you get more opportunities to do that with a thinner paint. So here we've got the ink that's been thinned down even more than it is as standard. Actually, that's interesting. The response is actually a little bit more immediate because although the opacity of the ink is slightly less because it's more thinned, the way that it flows out the airbrush is slightly better. So we're getting a little bit more response. We're building up the opacity even a little bit more quickly. Dagger stroke, so it's kind of gives me a feeling for how nicely it's working on trigger control is lovely. And I'd say the control I've got over the color, I even slightly prefer it. So the point that we're making here is that if you want an optimal performance from your paint, you definitely don't want to do anything that stands in the way of how easily the airbrush can atomize it. No matter what airbrush you have, no matter which brand it is, the thinner the paint, the easier the job of atomization, and then the more control you have over the build-up of the color and the quality of the surface finish that you create on the surface that you're painting. Obviously, there's a limit to that. If you go super, super thin where the pigment is so diffuse that you barely build any color, of course, that's not useful. So I'm not going to say it's limitless, but it's certainly, I think from what I see in the comments generally on the channel, people are always a little bit too concerned about thinning more than less, when actually thinning more than less really is the road to nirvana as far as the airbrush is concerned. I'd also like to take a look at priming. Now, the reason why I think this is a really important topic is because a lot of people think that you've got to put primer down heavily. This myth comes from the car refinishing trade, and the reason is because there we use primer for a very different purpose. There we use primer to perfect an imperfect surface. So we typically want to put down a lot of build, flat it back, and then end up with a perfect surface. With the molding, you're buying a surface that's got lots of surface relief in it. That's the model that you're buying. You definitely don't want to lose any of that. So we're really using the primer kind of like a chemical surfacer. We're using it to bond to that plastic and provide a good surface for the subsequent paint to bond to. We're not trying to build anything. So you can put primer down radically over thinned, and I just want to demonstrate the extent to which you can do that and still get a good prime, because the last thing that I want you to do is to use a primer that's a bit too thick and lose any of that beautiful detail that you paid for in that model, and have an airbrush that's not performing at peak performance because the paint's a bit too thick. So what we're going to do, we're going to use a Vallejo primer. I'm going to actually thin it 2 to 1. Now normally we'd do it 1 to 1, but for the sake of this demo, we're going to go 2 to 1 just to make the point. So we're going to drop in the thinner, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 drops of that. And we're going to put 3 drops of primer into that. So a little bit over 2 to 1 actually. 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to do a bubble back mix. So I pinch the front of the airbrush, press down on the trigger to start the air and pull it back a little, just to mix the 2 components together. That should be all good to go. Put on the glasses because nowadays it's really necessary. And we're going to pick up our little lad here and go about seeing if we can prime him. So it's going to need a lot more passes because the pigment is fairly weak in there. But you can already see how we're darkening him off, getting the prime down, and we're just making such a wonderfully perfect surface finish with this over-thinned prime. So we just got to be careful to always maintain that satin finish and never let it become a gloss. Because when it becomes a gloss, that's when the paint's very wet, can become mobile, and then we can get sags, we can get paint running into parts of the molding, and then we're doing exactly what we don't want to do, which is lose detail. So I'm just focusing on the top half of the little lad here, not the bottom, because that then gives us the ability to contrast it. Now, obviously, I know that was a slow prime because we're using a very diffuse medium, but just look at how beautiful that finish is that we've got there. There's no graining, no texture, no nothing from the primer. We've completely preserved the quality of the molding, the sort of smoothness of the shoulder pads and so on. Absolutely gorgeous. And so using a prime radically over thinned like this has got some real advantages. The way that the brush will interact with this surface now, because it's still so beautifully smooth, is better. Just great. So I would strongly urge you to consider thinning your paint a little bit more than you think you should, especially when you're going for coverage, because it makes the airbrush perform better, you get a better surface finish, and everything is actually easier that way. Even the cleanup is easier too. Which brings us neatly to metallics. Now metallics are interesting because they've got bits in them. The modern metallic is usually a pearl which has got very, very tiny chips of mica or prismatic materials in it, but they are very small. And so you typically don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to go through the airbrush. 0.25, 0.28, 0.3, 0.4, 0.45, absolutely no problem for the modern metallic. So you want to thin that paint to the point where the drip is non-elastic, and that's the minimum level of thinning that you want to do. I'd like you to consider experimenting with thinning it more than that and just paying attention to what benefits that gives you. It certainly makes it easier to work for long periods with the airbrush. But the only thing you've got to watch out for is just make sure that when you're painting onto that surface, you don't allow a gloss to develop. You want to see a satin, but not a gloss. A gloss means it's getting a little bit too wet. I hope it's been really useful. I hope I've shown you that this applies to inks, to paints, to brush paints, to metallics, to primers. Any of it you can treat the same way. When you get the thinning ratio right, everything gets easier. And over-thinning rather than under-thinning is definitely the side of that equation that you want to be on. Other than that, If you know anybody who's finding airbrushing a little bit frustrating, this piece of information could be what you use to strengthen your friendship with them. So make sure that you pass it on to them, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one, and I look forward to it.